Welcome to the last session of the last day of the PSE-CEPR Policy Forum 2023. I am Jean-Marc Vittori. I am a columnist for the business daily Les Echos, and I'm very happy to be here on one of the topics on which I work not always, but much of my time. Today's topic is greening. Since this morning, I'm not sure that the economy is greening, but I'm sure economists are trying to work on greening economics and especially macroeconomics. We have seen it today, this morning and this afternoon. It's necessary if you want to find the way to succeed in this major transformation. Macroeconomics and greening are two words which are more and more used together. You can see in the international organization, as the IMF, the ILO, in central banks. François Villeroy de Galhau, the governor of Banque de France, made a speech in London 2 months ago on that topic specifically. And these two words come with usual other words in macroeconomics, as investment, as inflation, as competitiveness, as financing, but also, of course, inequalities and social justice. We have two great panelists who work hard on these issues during these last months, last years. And we'll begin with you, Beatrice Weder di Mauro. You are online. You are a professor of international economics at the Geneva Graduate Institute. You are also the president of the CEPR, and you had, before many other activities, you've been one of the Weizen in Germany. You have a few words about a new trilemma you identified recently between carbon, security, and competitiveness. I don't say anything more. It's your turn.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be online, at least. I was on my way to Paris. Very much on my way to Paris, and had to turn around because I caught a bug, and it caught me. So I'm unfortunately ill and back at home. But I at least wanted to have the opportunity to speak, at least address this panel online. As I said at the beginning of the week, this is a fantastic new venture for CEPR to be cooperating with PSE on this policy forum, and everything that I have heard is that it has been a great week and a great success. Now I want to share a few slides about some of the issues that, in my view, are key in thinking about the triangle of decarbonization, energy security, and competitiveness. And I want to just make sure that you are seeing my slides. I am sharing them now. Can you see them?
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I start with something that is very well known, but bears reminding. The global CO2 emissions have not peaked yet. We are still, they are still increasing, and it is no longer. They have peaked in Europe and in US, but not for the whole world. And of course, the whole world is what we have to be looking at when it comes to global climate. And the other thing that bear reminding, again, I am pretty sure that many in Paris are very much aware of this, but I always notice again and again that not everybody is this what I call, the most important table in the world when it comes to climate change. And it is from the IPCC report, the last IPCC report on the physical evidence, on the physical science that we know. What this table is showing is the remaining carbon budget that we have. We have used up in brackets 2,400 gigatons of CO2. That's how much emissions are already in the atmosphere. And that has already warmed up the world on average by a little bit more than 1 degree. So in order to stay below 1.5, that would mean that we only have a little bit less than half a degree to go. And if we want to have a high security, a high amount of certainty that this will be reached, namely 83%, that's how you read this table, then there are 300 gigatons that are still left in the carbon budget. And the reminder here is that we are spending about 40 gigatons of CO2 per year. Now, this is, and by the way, this is from 2020, so we've already spent some of that budget too. Now, increasingly, I do see that people go more for the number that is a bit, have less certainty. We have only 50% certainty that we can stay below 1.5, but we have a pretty good confidence that we could stay below 1.7. And that is 500 gigatons. That's in fact the one I will be using. So 500 gigatons is what we have left. Now, how are we addressing this as a world? Well, as economists, there is one very clear agreement among economists, namely that we would best be addressing this through carbon pricing. And yes, the good news is carbon pricing is actually more popular than you think. It is, there are many countries that have introduced some form of carbon pricing. The bad news is that most of these countries have a very, very low price of carbon, and definitely much too low to, through this instrument, stay within the budget. And some of the bigger emitters also have very low prices of carbon. So the EU with the ETS somewhere in the area of $100 or euros, not much difference these days, is more or less where as a starting point we should be, but actually we should probably more be going towards 200. But that's where the whole world should be moving, and that's probably almost certainly not happening. So carbon pricing, yes, absolutely, yes. We should have this and should not give up on the instrument, but de facto, we have to also look at other instruments. And here is now this triangle that I suggest is not quite an impossible trinity, but I have depicted it as if it was an impossible trinity. What is similar is, we have three goals, and there are some trade-offs between them, depending on how many instruments we want to deploy. These trade-offs will be more striking. So let's say we want climate change mitigation, so decarbonization, but we also discovered that we need our countries to be resilient. We need energy security, and we would like to still have some competitiveness. And here, when people talk about competitiveness, very often they have industrial competitiveness in mind. Now, if we go for CO2 pricing, which is the best instrument for addressing climate mitigation, then this increases the cost of energy and will have issues for competitiveness if the polluter has to pay, which is well recognized, and is why CBAM is one of the ways to mitigate that competitiveness concern. Whether this increases or decreases resilience is not quite clear. On the one hand side, in the longer run, if the green transformation should increase resilience, in the short run, it's not quite clear. Now let's look at the other instrument that is very much talked about these days. That's the not going for pricing, but instead for subsidies, and adding to that a local content clause, as the IRA has done. That is, how good is that for climate mitigation? Not so clear. It is probably good, at least in the short run, for the competitiveness of the US jobs. And for resilience, whether it is good for resilience, it is, again, not so clear. So I have here a table in which I try to look at the different instruments that are out there. I already talked about carbon pricing, But then there is also, of course, the possibility of just regulating. So Germany has just done a big experiment of this kind by suggesting a law which would have made heat pumps which would have prohibited renewing any kind of fossil fuel-driven warming in housing. And so that was a big debate. Over the last months, you could have thought that is the biggest problem that Germany has, is the Wärmepumpe. And yes, that would have, if it could have been enforced, yes, that would have helped for climate. Would it have helped for resilience? Probably yes, because you become more independent more quickly. Competitiveness, not really. But it was not really able. I mean, politically, they were not able to go through with it, and now there is a weaker form of this law is going to go through probably. I already talked about clean tech subsidies. And I talked about domestic content requirements, which are driven mostly by the competitiveness and not by the other two goals. In fact, here it's there are trade-offs which are not good. And then finally, that is what I suppose that Philippe Aguillon did this morning, talking about R&D funding, which, yes, has climate and competitiveness and maybe also resilience benefits, but I would submit that those are more in the long run. So in other words, not asking one instrument to try and address all of these goals is obviously not going to work. And from this point of view, we could say, having many instruments is maybe not so bad, except that we still have to keep in mind the overall budget constraint. So here is what we are using up at the moment the overall the 40 gigatons. This is the yearly emissions. So we have 300 to 400 gigatons left, I said, and they are being used very unevenly across the world right now. The countries are scaled by the size of their total emissions, not per capita, because the planet doesn't care how much anybody does emit per capita. It is the tons that matter. So these are countries' tons, that's their size. And what you will notice immediately is, of course, that it is the Northern Hemisphere, including India and very few countries. And in Africa, it's only South Africa that actually appears. The rest of Africa actually is almost invisible. So this is when we speak about climate equity. This is the problem, right? Now, the other problem is, and this is not the exact opposite, but it does illustrate the other problem, namely, and by the way, this is from a new survey which was published by VoxDev Lit. So VoxDev, for those of you who don't know, is a sister platform of VoxEU. VoxEU, I hope most of you are familiar with, is the policy platform of CEPR. And VoxDev is also run by CEPR, and it is all about development. And what VoxDev does, we don't do in VoxEU, is large literature surveys. So this is a new literature survey just published recently about climate adaptation and its costs. And what this graph does here, it shows the impact of a 1 degree increase in average temperature on per capita output. And then the countries here are scaled by the proportion of their population. So this is more an impact graph. And clearly it is almost the opposite, not quite, but almost the opposite in terms of who is most impacted to who is most on the giving side in the sense of emissions. So now, as last thing, I want to show one more thing in terms of climate equity, and because what I'm submitting is that we don't only have a problem of the instruments, we also have a problem of the distribution. And here is a different type of distribution that I want to be so this is actually the distribution that is implicit in Paris. In what sense is this the distribution that is implicit in Paris? What I do is I do take the remaining carbon budget, so 500 gigatons, and then I give each country or each region the share of the emissions that they need to mitigate of that budget. So, example, the EU has to mitigate 8% of the emissions because the EU is now emitting 8% of the emissions. That's how much they have to come down with, right? So I just give it that share, and then I multiply that by the population. And sorry, then I divide that by the population of the EU, so that's 440 million, and that gives a carbon budget per capita, a final carbon budget, how much any EU citizen is allowed implicitly to use up of this remaining carbon budget. The result here is 88 tons per capita. Now, according to some studies, the EU's regulatory framework is already driving towards something like a per capita carbon budget of about 80. So the EU would actually be fine, more or less. But the problem is not in the EU so much. You see, a US citizen, by the same calculation, gets a carbon budget which is much larger. Also a Russian and a Chinese, and compare this now to somebody in Africa. So according to current implicit allocations, I'm not saying that anybody is actually making this calculation, right? But implicitly, by saying we are all going to net zero from where we are, the fact that we are starting at a certain point is important, because that's how we are distributing the remaining carbon budget. One way of looking at this is to say this is not going to happen. And I will leave it there. I'm sure we will have a discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. We spoke very much today about smart industrial policy, and we see it's not easy to make a smart industrial policy. And you had the fact that we have also a geopolitical issue. It's not the only point on which we have a geopolitical issue now, but it's also a huge problem to solve. Jean Pisani-Ferry, you are professor of economics with Sciences Po in Paris. You are also non-resident senior fellow for the Peterson Institute. You are, between many other things, you have been Commissioner General of France Stratégie, the Ideas Lab of French government. And recently you have made a report with Selma Mahfouz about the evaluation of the macroeconomic impacts of the greening of economics. It has been a huge work with dozens of people, thousands of pages. You said that it would be necessary to invest an extra of 66 billion euros per year in France for going to the greening of the economics, of the economy. And you also said another thing, but which in France get much more attention, that it would be maybe necessary to create a new tax on wealthy people for financing a small part of this investment. We would like to hear you a few words on that work.
Thank you, Jean-Marc, and hello, Beatrice. Before I sort of move on to discussing those things, just a comment on what Beatrice just showed. I mean, the Paris Agreement is a result of the impossibility of agreeing on a distribution of the emissions. So basically, it's a pledge and review mechanism. The good thing is that there is, in principle, an agreement on the target, and there is no agreement on the distribution of efforts to reach this target. So what you're advocating in a way is a sort of and I agree with you, something that would be more equitable, that wouldn't start from the emission that exists, but that would start from the a better distribution of the global carbon budget. But this has proved impossible. So I think that we have to live with the Paris Agreement because that's the best we can achieve in this state of the world. Now, let me move to discussing what I wanted to present. I mean, I think we are in a moment where the question, the climate question, has become a macro question. And it has become a macro question because it has moved from being beyond the horizon to being within the horizon. It's not that, you know, the climate economics has been underdeveloped. I mean, the great research on climate economics. But the framework for this climate economics research has been much more sort of public finance type framework, intertemporal optimization, all we know about, you know, the work of Nordhaus, etc. And this has left aside completely the question of the macro impact of climate action. And suddenly, this question of the climate impact of macro impact of climate action has become part of the discussion. And I think that's a big novelty. The big novelty that everybody recognizes now that it has become a macro question. And we don't have the sort of proper framework to analyze that. I know this is debatable. Some people say we do have the proper framework. I pretend we don't have exactly the proper framework because, you know, if you ask people in the treasuries, in the Ministry of Finance, they don't have the proper tools to do this work. And it's interesting because we're not speaking of a radical transformation. We're just speaking of an adaptation of the existing framework. So we need to understand better what are the key mechanisms. We need to understand better what could be the fiscal cost, whether they should be in the first place a fiscal cost. We should be understanding better why there are problems with what Isabel Schnabel has called the great volatility, the return of volatility after the end of the great moderation. We've got to understand better problems of competitiveness, which come also from the heterogeneity of strategies. So all that is becoming part of the discussion. 2 words on the mechanisms. Our take in the report is that the long-term mechanism is clearly the reorientation of technical progress. And this is delivering. I think Philippe must have spoken eloquently about that this morning. This is delivering, but this is a long-term mechanism. Now, in the short term, we do have to act in the short term because we do have to act now. In the short term, the key mechanisms are sufficiency. Interestingly, that's a topic on which we didn't have a proper framework as economists, to think about sufficiency, because we thought that, you know, consumers are rational optimizers, so there's nothing to change to the choice of consumers. And if you start thinking about that, you realize that there are some changes that may be, you know, not very detrimental to welfare, to utility, but that could have positive externalities in terms of reducing the emissions. We sort of, you know, in the report, we try to make sense of it by incorporating in the analysis some of the lessons from other social sciences, from social psychology, the notion that nudges can actually affect behavior without costing in terms of utility. So that's an interesting aspect. But overall, at the 2030 horizon, our estimate is that sufficiency, sobriété in French, cannot contribute more than 15% to the total reduction of emissions. So it's part of the job. The big mechanism, the main mechanism, will be the substitution of capital for fossil fuels. And if you think a second about it, I mean, that's the mechanism behind many of the transformation that are at work. That's the mechanism behind the renewables, the reliance on renewables, but that's also the mechanism behind the electric vehicles. It's also the mechanism behind the transformation, the insulation of houses. It's also the mechanism behind the heat pump, etc. So this is a generic mechanism. And the way we have to think about it, and I'm speaking, Kathleen is here. Kathleen contributed quite a lot to this analysis, is that those investments that are required are not ordinary investments. They are investments that do not contribute to increasing productivity, do not contribute to increasing potential output. They are contributing and they're designed to reduce emissions, so to contribute to changing, in a way, the model. If GDP were sort of properly measured, net of damages to the environment, most likely this would show up in terms of a positive contribution to GDP. But GDP, the way it is measured, this is not accounted for. So we have to factor in the fact that those investments are just not ordinary investment. They're investments that do not increase potential output. Let me end on 2 points very quickly. One is the question of the fairness of the transformation. Beatrice spoke eloquently about the international fairness. There is also the question of the internal fairness. If you look at the numbers, this transformation is highly unequal. It's highly, it weighs a lot on low-income or even middle-income households. The numbers you have to keep in mind is that the change of your vehicle or the changes at your home for middle-class outcome, investments amount to a year of annual income. So it's big. And obviously, the more you go, in the income ladder, the higher you go, the less important it is. So that's the reason for the resentment of people who feel that climate change is about changing their lifestyle, whereas for higher income households, it's not really about changing their lifestyle. They can afford it. I mean, they can buy the Tesla and they can change the heating system, and they can insulate the houses. I mean, it's just not a big sacrifice for low-income or middle-income households. This is a big sacrifice, which means that the equity question, the equity dimension, is absolutely major, and you're seeing that, in Germany, as Beatrice was alluded to. You've seen that in France, and you're seeing that in many places. So, which means that this equity dimension is central, and that brings us to something we may wish to discuss later, which is why we proposed sort of a one-off tax on financial wealth. Last point, it's a major change in international economics, because we've seen, we rely on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, except for the US, they're produced in certain countries. Some of these countries, they export exclusively fossil fuels. So it's going to be a major change in the major shock to the global economy. And I think that's not something that has been discussed extensively in the report, but that deserves really to be discussed much more. because I think that's one of the key transformations ahead.
Thank you, Jean. Beatrice, any comment about what said Jean?
No, I mean, I agree with everything Jean has said, in particular the importance of, not only macroeconomics is back, but macroeconomics is now part of climate change. And climate change is part of macroeconomics in both directions. The internal equity issue that he mentioned is extremely important, especially, of course, in democracies, and that's where we want to live. How do you get sufficient support for the different measures? And there will be some need for compensation, some need for redistribution in order to get this support. My point at the international level is that, Jean, I agree with you. Paris is our best hope and chance. I don't want to throw away Paris. It's just that my impression is that through the inequity that we are building into the system and the inability still to actually, in significant amounts, make sure that the countries that have a very small implicit carbon budget, we will just not get there. We will just overrun the global carbon budgets. I mean, those countries definitely have much less incentives to stick to the net zero commitment. So yes, equity problems are paramount in this space.
On following up on that issue, you showed us a triangle. Haven't we also a triangle in each country between decarb, one part, freedom and democracy on the second part, and social justice in the third part? What's the best way for trying to solve this triangle?
I'm not sure I heard you well. You had social justice and democracy
social justice,
on your triangle?
decarbonation, and freedom, democracy. You begin to you went already a little bit on that topic.
Okay, that's too hard to do out of. I mean, my triangle does not have the political dimensions on it, or only implicitly. Because resilience, of course, is now something that we are politically also seeing as important. Resilience meaning security, meaning being less dependent from others, in particular fossil fuel deliveries. But maybe Jean has a better answer.
Jean.
I think you're going to confuse everyone by adding another trilemma to the one put forward by Beatrice. So I suggest we stick to the trilemma, to Beatrice's.
Another point is the fact that we have a big debate, and you began also, Jean, to come to this debate. It's can we have growth and less emissions? What's the solution? How do you see that issue? 5 years ago, I was optimistic on that issue, and more I think about it and I work about it, I'm less optimistic. Of course, it depends on what is GDP, of course, but beyond that.
It depends on the, yes. The good news is that the national accountants start taking the issue seriously and have started thinking about measurement that would actually go some way towards measuring better what's economic performance, and that's really good news. On the conventional aspect of things, I'm optimistic because if you look at the cost of renewables, it has collapsed, and it continues collapsing, which is extremely good news. So we can produce energy there are problems of intermittency, there are problems of, we don't have a storage technology or an efficient storage technology. This is still under development. But the simple fact that you can get electricity at a cost that's lower than the cost of fossil fuels, I mean, not the full cost, but the sort of marginal cost, that's extremely good news. That makes me optimistic. And so I don't think there's a permanent trade-off between growth and the preservation of climate. There's a temporary trade-off, in the years to come, for the reason I have explained, but there's no permanent trade-off. And if you think of sufficiency, sufficiency. People tend to think we have to choose the degrowth is a sort of the name of the thing, but sufficiency doesn't mean necessarily that there will be less growth. I mean, it just depends on what you do with the income you're saving by not consuming fossil fuels. If you actually use these savings, the savings to consume something else, it can have a positive effect on growth. It all depends on the productivity, the relative productivity of the sectors. So not an easy question to answer, but there is no logical reason why there should be less growth.
Beatrice?
Yes, I agree, and a lot of some of the climate mitigation measures in the short run do produce some growth effects which are negative, but they always tend to be quite small compared to the negative growth effects that would be predicted if we do not mitigate, and that has to be the comparison. I would always caution against saying that the green transformation is necessarily a big growth story for the reasons that Jean has elaborated in terms of these investments and the type of these investments. There is a more optimistic view, and I think probably Philippe Aguillon would have held that and exposed that, where the innovation that is created through clean tech research and new technology that is now developed will actually have a longer term positive growth effect. And the beauty of that story is that through that mechanism, we may be even solving my problem, the one that I was highlighting. If we can give to the rest of the world clean technology at cheap prices, then a lot of the dilemmas go away.
Yeah, but
just a note of caution. What I said applies to mitigation. There are the damages, and as Beatrice said, the cost of inaction is high. The problem is that we are paying already the cost of past inaction. We're going to continue to pay the price of insufficient action, and at the same time, we're going to invest into mitigation. So that's a challenge.
Have you any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Now it's your turn. What do you want to say, to ask? Have you any contradiction? Yeah. You'll have a mic soon. Can you identify yourself?
Hi, I'm Nuala Mulligan. I'm a student here at PSE. It's more of a, can you hear me now?
Yes.
It's more of a comment actually on your point on the changing GDP. It's something that the European Union is doing with their taxonomy. They're trying to allow investors to see not just the profit margin and borrowing costs. They're trying to bring in environmental damages into the investment framework. So I think that's something that national accounts and economists could be looking at for making our new measurement for the new GDP.
Jean?
It's. I think I mean, it's a big change to see that. I'm speaking here of the statistical office. I mean, the INSEE. They're considering publishing a figure that would give GDP net of damages to the environment. That requires quite a lot of work because, that requires having a price for those damages. And so that needs to be a reliable price with, all the sort of quality of national accounts. But they're not reluctant anymore to do it. And I think that's a big change. It's just at the beginning of transforming the way we measure economic performance. And actually, that's also true of private companies. I mean, I'm confident that the work that is being undertaken within the framework of the IFRS, the accounting standard institution, they're going to come up with, a better measurement of the economic performance, and that's going to be taken into account in the valuation of companies. So I think those things are real movers.
Beatrice, you want to add a comment?
Yes, maybe I would sort of step back and say that there are many things that are not in GDP and that we have long known for a long time. And it is not going to be easy to include one type of damage and not other types of damages. So I hope that, Jean, that you're right, that there is progress and there can be some kind of international coordinated step in this direction. It would certainly help if we had an additional number than the GDP number. But everything, I mean, the GDP number is not going to go away. And central banks and ministries of finance and so on will continue, I suspect, looking at that one when they do their projections of inflation or maybe you're right. Maybe for inflation and for tax income, that it's the wrong number. No, but my general point is that that changing GDP measurement has been a big task for a long time, and certainly is not going to change everything. We are already doing a lot of work in trying to measure what is damaging, what are the risks, and I did not see the speaker, but you're right. The EU taxonomy is part of that. The whole work on trying to get to better accounting standards is part of that. It is, at this stage, I am not so optimistic as you seem to be, Jean. Yes, the first thing is to create the better numbers, to have transparency, then to disclose. But then the next step has to be that there is actually action happening based on this disclosure. And finance has been very big at, talking about sustainable finance. It has been a little bit less big in actually doing it.
I can add a word as a journalist. It will not be easy also to explain to our readers that there is something else than GDP. GDP, it's broadly speaking production, activity, and to explain another concept, it will be difficult and it will take time. And I find fascinating to read again the words of Simon Kuznets when he presented the GDP the first time. There is a few pages of what is GDP and what is not GDP, which are fascinating still today, and we must have them in mind. Another question, Jean-Olivier? No? Let's go.
Maybe a small comment.
Say who you are for Beatrice.
I'm Ralph Martin from Imperial and LSE. small comment on what Beatrice said, right? I agree that maybe our only hope is that technology solves this in one way or another. And I think there is certainly room to say, look, we have to finance, we pass the technology on to developing countries. Although I think one story which has emerged in recent years is a quite interesting one here. It's really, I mean, what helped us bring the costs down in Europe that you were pointing out earlier? It was basically that, you know, they took something and improved it. And now the costs are coming down because what China is doing. That's where the technology is being developed on solar. And I think this is a model we really have to push much harder because, you know, there's an opportunity, you know. We have a lot of old infrastructure here, and it's really this old infrastructure which we have written off a long time ago. But in countries, now if I look at Africa, right? Africa is growing like crazy, and that's really where we have to not only, you know, put the new technologies, but that is a great place where we can develop the new technologies, where we can develop new smart grids that are much better than what we have there, and then not only develop Africa in the process, but re-export it into Europe. I think that needs to be a big program, and we should maybe not have too much of a colonial attitude here in this process. That might be helpful. Thanks.
Maybe we'll have two other questions.
That's exactly what I was referring to when I said there are big transformation coming in the international economy. That, you know, you can basically trade in renewables or trade on the basis of renewables, and that's a big change.
Yeah, so Jean-Olivier Hérault, PC. Some sense, real proof that now environmental issues are part of macroeconomics, the fact that now we are maybe concerned with the monetary policy, especially in front of this inflation and the real interest rate and the level of interest rate matters, especially for investment and especially for the speed of the environmental transition. So, what do you think about the central bank, European one, should take care of this new goal and maybe to change a little bit how to manage inflation? And another, let's say, issue is about the policy mix. Something how we could think about the policy mix now in Europe in order to sustain the environmental transition.
Beatrice, central banks and policy mix.
Yeah. No. I mean, if I understood correctly, the suggestion would be that the central banks should lower interest rates in order to make the investments cheaper and therefore facilitate the transition. Is that more or less the gist of what was the question?
It was not a suggestion. It was
no.
Just a
okay.
No. You're right. Let's say it's a suggestion. Okay.
It is. Okay. If it is, I say no.
If you help me to answer. Okay.
Then I would say no. I mean, you know, I'm not a central banker who always has to say our mandate is price stability, but you know, we've just had a very good experience of what happens when inflation really gets out of hand, and how disturbing and what a huge shock this is. Also, how it is hugely redistributing. So giving the central bank too many mandates and saying they are all at the same level is always difficult. So the ECB says, therefore, correctly, in my view, that inflation has to be number one and is number one. And then within secondary mandates, supporting the economic policies of the European Union is number two. And there, climate change mitigation is clearly one of the important ones. So if there is a trade-off between inflation and investment, then the central banks, it's not their job. Then it's really the government's jobs. But if there is no trade-off, if inflation goes back to targets, and if we go back to the great moderation, and you know, R minus G is negative again, then both governments and central banks have an easier time to be supporting explicitly, or in the other case implicitly, the investment. So I hope I was addressing the question. And on the comment from before with African technology, I think I can only agree that should be something that we have to talk about much more. Also, because all the investment that is being made in non-renewables, there are very young. There's a young stock of coal mines in the world that are, have been built very few years ago. Every new coal mine that is being built has a lifespan of many decades, and then getting them out of commission, newly installed infrastructure is going to be very hard, also politically. So we have to really be careful not to promote or to also think of getting out of fossil fuels and not installing new infrastructure. So the number there, I mean, for most coal mines in Europe, they are all old. So there are hardly any new ones. But in Indonesia, for instance, there are many relatively new coal mines. Getting them out of commission is going to be costly, which is why the G20 has actually done a deal with Indonesia, which, if I remember correctly, was about 20 billion in order to decommission and get out of coal more quickly. So those kind of things are going to be important.
Jean?
On inflation, I agree that the central bank should focus on inflation and should not, have too many objectives. The question is what will happen with inflation, and I think what's certain is that there will be much more volatility in the next 10 years because we're speaking of the substitution of new sources of energy for traditional fossil fuels. And we're speaking of internal disturbances in the euro area economy, whereby there will be, sort of negative supply shock, if you wish, by having more investment and not necessarily more capacity. So I think that's a moment where the ECB, in the name of its own mandate, should, and we're going to have, changes in relative prices, significant changes in the relative prices. I think in this kind of environment, I would sort of plea for monetary policy that does not stick strictly to the 2% target, but give some room for, breathing space for relative prices. And I think that would be important. And then the question is, do we need eventually, do we want eventually the central banks to change its target from 2% to 3%? But that's another debate. But at least in the next 10 years, I think they should be erring on the side of caution, not being too strict.
But even if you focused only on inflation, if we don't invest huge amounts now in new way of producing energy, we are sure that we'll have much higher inflation in 10 or 20 years. The International Energy Agency told us that the peak oil will be in 2028, so it's 5 years from now, after the production will decline. So it will mean higher prices if we don't have other sources of energy. So even if you look only at inflation, you have short-term inflation, okay, but you have also long-term inflation.
Well, if you do the transition, you're not going to be affected in the same way.
But if you don't,
yeah, which means that central banks have a sort of a natural interest into favoring the transition, because it's in the long term it's a much more stable source of energy. I mean, we're going to get rid of the source of volatility.
Another question?
And I think this was
Ralph again?
Okay. No, sorry. No, but it was on that. I mean, I think the point is that they're slowing down at the moment transition. So ultimately, what they're doing at the moment creates more inflation. I think that is the point. So even if you're only worried about inflation, the higher increasing the interest rate is. I think that is the debate. I don't know what you.
I don't think, I sort of share the concern that you need to anchor expectations. I mean, you can't let price expectation, get de-anchored. I think that's a price to pay in the short term. The question is, once you have taken back control of inflation, how should you behave? Should you behave in a way that is very strict? I mean, forces inflation to go down to 2% and does not give room to breathing space for relative prices, or should you accept that there is more breathing space?
Another question?
David, you had a question?
No? You know everything about the topic? You have all the answers? Great. Very good news. So maybe Jean-Olivier and Beatrice, you want to close this session and this week?
Maybe Beatrice first. It's really a pity not to have you with us, really.
Well, as I said, it's been a great week. I have been told a lot about it, so I have been following you on Twitter, and I was very much on the way there. I promise to be there next year. As I said at the beginning, for CEPR, this is a very important additional event that we have in Paris, that we will have in Paris. The summer policy forum with PSE, and then there is the winter Paris symposium, which will take place in December. CEPR is now really in full transition to Paris. I usually have as my background the view from the Paris office, which I love, but I wanted to put this one up in order to highlight the fact that we are celebrating also 40 years of the existence of this network, and we are very happy to be in Paris with you. Next time I will be there physically. Thank you.
Maybe just to conclude, so to say, as I said at the beginning, when opening this policy forum, to say thank you to the speakers who participate in this event. So I think it was very rich debate, so different issues, but some common issues. For sure, environmental transition was one of them. For development issue, when the speech of Esther Duflo was very clear about the fact that it's not possible to think about development without taking into account the transition and the environmental transition. It was the same, the discussion about inflation with Olivier Blanchard and Governor of Banque de France about inflation, to take into account the question asked today was more or less was explicitly discussed, and also the discussion with Thomas Piketty about inequality, as Jean said, about the fact that it was a bit unfair international level, as Beatrice said. It was what Esther said, and also at the national level and country level. So I would say that it was very rich. I think it was the objective, and I think we met the objective. And for sure, there will be a second edition, and in the future, and quite sure that we meet more or less the same issues, but for sure other ones, about employment, about as a globalization or deglobalization or new globalization, all these issues that in PSE and everywhere in the world that we face, and we have a new edition next year for sure, and we invite you already to this event. So again, thank you again for being here, and see you next year for debate and rich debate between policymakers and researchers. That was the objective. Thank you very much.